Tonight, we ask the question Rabbi Jonathan Sacks once asked: how do you live with the constant threat of violence and war? That, he replied, takes faith. Israel is the people that has always been sustained by faith, faith in God, faith in the future, and faith in life itself. Thank you for joining us tonight at Yeshiva University's Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks-Herenstein Center to promulgate the scholarship and wisdom of Rabbi Sacks through a series of academic, communal, educational, and literary initiatives. We're committed to identifying and growing emerging talent for positions of communal influence and impact inspired by Judaism's wisdom and Yeshiva University's core values. Since October 7th, we have profiled Israel's leaders for critical conversations, provided weekly spiritual and intellectual resources, spearheaded student activism on behalf of the war, and are planning a series on promoting advocacy and combating anti-Semitism for our undergraduate students in the spring. I'm Erica Brown, director of the center, and tonight we welcome Dr. Danny Gordis, colleague and friend, to campus. Dr. Gordis joined us this week to receive Yeshiva University's Sacks Book Prize, one of today's largest literary book prizes, for his recent work, Impossible Takes Longer. Funded by the Rohr family, the prize is awarded to a book that reflects what is characteristic of all of Rabbi Sacks's books: textual seriousness, contemporary relevance, depth, elegance of style, and wide-reaching impact. Rabbi Sacks believed profoundly in the power of the written word. We thank the judges of the prize, Lady Elaine Sacks, Dr. Robbie George, Dr. Chava Tirosh Samuelson, Dr. Daniel Reinhold, and Dr. Shira Weiss. I also want to thank Dr. Weiss, Eliza Abrams-Koenig, and Malky Klausner for all the work that they've done to make sure that these events take place this week. Before we invite Pella Cohen from our first leadership cohort to the stage to introduce Dr. Gordis, we invite Donnie Minkoff from our most recent Leadership Scholars cohort to lead us in the recitation of Tehillim. Donnie.
Courage. David Ben-Gurion wrote, is a special kind of knowledge. The knowledge of how to fear what ought to be feared, and how not to fear what ought not to be feared. My name is Pella Cohen, and I am a junior at Stern and a leadership scholar here at Yeshiva University. To begin, I would like to thank the Sacks-Herenstein Center for Values and Leadership, specifically Dr. Brown and Eliza Abrams-Koenig, for all of the hard work put into making this event happen. On behalf of the student body, we thank you for your constant dedication to creating educational opportunities such as this for the entire Yeshiva University community. My family made Aliyah a couple of years ago to a beautiful community in Modi'in. While I don't see them very often, I never miss out on an opportunity to visit and enjoy the stunning land of Israel. My most recent trip ended October 5th when I headed back to New York for a camp reunion. I never expected to open my phone after Simchat Torah, one of the happiest days of the year, to feel a pit open at the bottom of my stomach. On October 7th, my eldest brother was called back to the IDF, leaving my sister-in-law at home and my parents and siblings in a constant state of worry. He is currently doing guard duty and has only had a few days to go back home and spend time with his wife and give my parents a hug. As someone whose family recently made Aliyah and has a brother who was called back, it is comforting to know that we have people like Dr. Daniel Gordis advocating for the safety of our home. Dr. Gordis is an American-born Israeli scholar and author who has written countless books, is the writer of the blog Israel from the Inside, and continues to be a regular journalist for the Jerusalem Post, Bloomberg View, along with many other magazines and papers. In 2014, the Jerusalem Post listed him as one of the world's top 50 most influential Jews, and more recently, Dr. Gordis is a Sacks Book Prize winner for his work, Impossible Takes Longer, 75 years after its creation, Has Israel Fulfilled its Founder's Dream, which reflects on the state of Israel from 1948 until now. Dr. Gordis is a proud Israeli advocate, and in these trying times has been very vocal fighting for the rights and protection of Israel. Tonight, the topic of Dr. Gordis' talk is Negotiating the Impossible, the Israeli Hostage Crisis. His talk will be followed by a Q&A. Thank you, Dr. Gordis, for coming, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. Oops, somewhere here. There we go. Thank you, Pella. Thanks to all of you for being here. It's really an honor to be here. I'm very grateful to all of you for coming out on a kind of a cold, dark evening in the middle of the winter. And I want to begin by reiterating the thanks that I expressed on Sunday evening to the Herenstein Center at Yeshiva University for the great honor of the prize. There's a way, my brother said to me when I told him that I won, he goes, wow, that's kind of amazing. I mean, for a book that's totally irrelevant at this point. That's what brothers are for. I would actually like to think that despite the fact that the book did not mention the judicial reform issue, did not mention the war, obviously, the claim that it makes about Israel having created a new Jew has actually been borne out by what has happened inside Israel since, let's say, October 8th, or even in the early hours of October 7th. But we're not going to talk about the book itself so much tonight. We're going to talk about the issue of Pidyon Shvuyim, the issue of the hostages, which is obviously an impossibly painful issue. And I'm going to try to put it in some context, a larger context, not the halachic context, which I think is obvious to most people here, but to try to say something about the issue of Pidyon Shvuyim in the larger context of Zionism and what's happened to Zionism since October 7th, and how the people who are leading Israel, which definitely does not include me, need to think about a whole array of really ultimately impossible choices that have to be made. And the way I would begin by saying this is that in order to think about the hostage issue, which is just morally impossible at this point, also probably militarily impossible and diplomatically impossible, but impossible on a number of levels, is to try to understand, is to try to think about it at least a little bit in the terms of Zionism writ large, and to ask ourselves what Zionism really is. Now that seems like an obvious question, but it's actually not. In other words, if we had actually set this up, some screen and everybody takes out their phone and you get a chance to write, 3 words, 4 words, what do you think Zionism is? And then it all flashes up on the screen in some algorithm. The one that gets the most votes is in the middle and bigger and all that. It's not entirely obvious what everybody would say. One of the things that I think commonly gets said, aside from the obvious one, which is that Zionism is about the creation of a Jewish state, but that sort of begs the question, right? Why create a Jewish state? Zionism, I think, at the end of the day, was not about creating a Jewish state. The Jewish state was the means to a much larger and a much more important end, which cannot be achieved without a Jewish state, the Zionists claim, and I would agree. But the purpose was not a state. The state was simply a tool, and the state remains a tool. The main function of Zionism, at least many Zionist thinkers would argue, I think, is to be the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. Now, what does that actually mean? A national liberation movement is fundamentally intended to change the existential condition of a people. If a people or a race or a gender or a group or whatever has a liberation movement, its fundamental claim is that something about the way that it exists in the world is either wrong or unfair or intolerable or undeserved or in some way fundamentally at odds with the way that the cosmos ought to operate. That's fundamentally what the early Zionists said. What the early Zionists did fundamentally was to diagnose Judaism of Europe in the late 19th century. Pinsker is a classic example because he was actually trained as a doctor, and therefore used kind of classic diagnostic language in talking about the various ailments and the various maladies from which the Jewish people suffered and what the cures for each of those maladies was going to be. He didn't start out, by the way, as a statist. He gradually moved to that over the course of time when he began to realize and understand that there was no way that the Jewish condition in Europe was going to be able to change while the Jews were still in Europe. But he pointed to specific maladies of the Jewish people. For example, he said, a normal people needs to have a language, not a borrowed language, not a language that people sort of understand because they happen to live in that country. A people has a language. You can't imagine a genuine Russian people, the world of Dostoevsky and so forth. You can't imagine that people existing without a shared language, because the language is not only a means of communication, it has a certain terminology, it has a certain vocabulary, it has a certain way of expressing itself that is uniquely Russian. Same thing is true of the French, the same thing is true of great languages all over the world. Hebrew was obviously long dormant. It wasn't dormant liturgically, it wasn't dormant in terms of learning, but as a lingua franca, as a language which was actually spoken on a day-to-day basis, it really didn't more or less exist. It's really not an exaggeration to say, 150 years ago? 150 years ago, you could have taken every single person on planet Earth, on the entire planet, who spoke Hebrew, and put them into one of the hotels in Midtown, and a lot of them would have had singles. There were very, very, very few people who were these early Hebraists who even, sort of around Ben Yehuda's time, some even a little bit before, were trying to crank out something that looked like a spoken language. But Pinsker said, a genuine people has a language. And the only way to have a language is to have a place where that language is going to be spoken. So that was, for example, one of his diagnoses. But his major diagnosis, of course, was that the Jewish people were simply victims on call. That you could do to the Jew whatever you wanted to do to the Jew, whenever you wanted to do it, and however you wanted to do it, and how long you wanted to do it, and the repercussions would be basically none. And then all you would announce as you departed whatever shtetl you had just ceased butchering, that you would be back when you chose to be back. And that, of course, was not the condition of all of European Jewry, but certainly in Central and Eastern Europe, it was the condition much more than anybody would have liked to have thought that it was. And that was the fundamental malady that the Zionists pointed to, that no people lived that way. That was not a normal way to live. And think about it, by the way. Go back to early political thinkers of the West. Go back to Hobbes or Locke. The fundamental reason that people come out of the state of nature, for those of you that remember back then, a long time ago, I don't mean to remember Locke and Hobbes, I just mean the people, I mean what they wrote. The idea that the reason that people leave the state of nature is fundamentally for protection. I give up some of my rights, you give up some of your rights, but we have a mutual protection pact. And writ large, that's what a nation state ultimately becomes, or that's at least what a country becomes. And the French had it, and the Spanish had it, and the Germans had it, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire had it, and so on and so forth. And what the Jews had in common with Jews all over the world was that they didn't have it anywhere. There was nothing to protect them anywhere on earth. And that was the fundamental claim that Zionism made, that something had to change about the existential condition of the Jew that had to do with safety. And I'm obviously stressing safety now because that's going to bring us in a couple of minutes right back to October 7th. But the fundamental claim of Zionism was that there were all sorts of things wrong with us. We didn't have a language, and we didn't have a culture, and there wasn't a national theater, and there weren't nearly enough presses producing not only Hebrew literature, but Yiddish literature, and so forth. There was a whole array of things. But the most fundamental thing that was wrong with the Jewish people, said Pinsker, but many others, Jabotinsky was the preeminent expresser of this, was that the Jews were essentially victims on call. You got to do to the Jews what you wanted to do to the Jews, when you wanted to do it to the Jews, for as long as you wanted to do it, and you could come back whenever you wanted. And that was what they fundamentally said had to change. And the fundamental promise of Zionism, there were many promises, but the fundamental promise of Zionism was that Europe of that sort would not come to wherever it would be that we establish our state. Whether it was going to be in Uganda, which was a fleeting idea that thankfully passed and did not go very far, whether it was going to be in Madagascar, which was also suggested, whether it was going to be around the Great Lakes region, believe it or not, which was also suggested. There were 8 or so major suggestions, most of which have been totally forgotten. No matter where it was, what Bialik describes in Kishinev, what Bialik describes in his poem Be'ira Harega, or what Bialik describes in his poem Ala Shchita, those sorts of things simply were not going to happen. And the crisis that Zionism finds itself in now, in December 2023, and Zionism finds itself in a crisis, is not just the war, which is brutal and long and not clearly winnable and not clearly being won, all of the bravado to the contrary notwithstanding. The fundamental crisis that Zionism faces in December 2023 is that on October 7th, Zionism actually failed to keep its promise to the Jewish people because Europe came to the land of Israel, because parts of the state of Israel turned into Kishinev. There had been terrorist attacks before, but they were fleeting and they were brief and we responded. The notion that people hid, cowering in bunkers if they were on bases, and in mamadim if they were in their own homes, for 18 hours, for 20 hours before anybody came, that these doors that were never meant to be locked from the inside, because who was going to come in? They were meant to protect you from rockets, could not protect you from grenades, could not protect you from semi-automatic gunfire and so forth. The fact that thousands and thousands and thousands of people were petrified that day, and at the end of it, 1,200 civilians and several hundred other security personnel, soldiers and policewomen and policemen were all dead. The fundamental the fundamental break that day was that Zionism had failed to keep its promise to the Jewish people. And we need to understand that as the context in which we think or need to understand, to try to understand how Israeli leaders are thinking about the issue of Pidyon Shvuyim today, the issue of the hostages. Because the issue of the hostages is now being discussed in a context in which Zionism has already failed the Jewish people. When Entebbe took place, nobody had failed anybody except for airport security. The Jews had not failed anybody. Zionism had not failed anybody. Israel had not failed anybody. They were terrorists, and they took over a plane, and they took it to Entebbe. Thank God we were able to rescue most of the people. But 2 things are important about Entebbe. One of them is that nobody Jewish had made any violation of a fundamental promise. And number 2, there was an instinctive sense of responsibility that pervaded the Jewish world and that pervaded Israel. If you want to ask what Zionism is, we said that one possible definition is the notion that it's the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, or it's a movement meant to change the existential condition of the Jewish people. Another way of thinking about Zionism is that it is fundamentally synonymous with the sense of responsibility. Doesn't often get said that way, but that's what Chana Senesh is. I mean, Chana Senesh was a suicide mission. I mean, it ended up literally being a suicide mission. But if you think about it logically, and I don't mean, God forbid, to do her any disrespect, but the idea that you were going to take young people, and she wasn't the only one, who were basically militarily untrained and parachute them behind enemy lines, and in the middle of Nazi-controlled Europe, they were going to try to save Jews, it was basically a ludicrous idea. It made absolutely no sense, and it's not surprising that she was caught. And it's tragic that she was tortured and executed and basically didn't manage to accomplish what the group had hoped to accomplish. But what animated the movement of people who, against all odds, sought to take people who were fundamentally untrained and parachute them behind enemy lines was a sensibility that could not be overcome. The sensibility is that we may be small, we may not be a country, we may not have an army, but we actually owe them. We are responsible for them. Some notion of Kol Yisrael Arevim Ze Bazeh actually is what came to be expressed in the life and tragic death of Chana Senesh. Excuse me. It also becomes clear, not only in Entebbe, it becomes clear in Gilad Shalit. We can debate all we want, good deal, bad deal. It's obvious. Sinwar, who now runs Hamas, was released as part of the Gilad Shalit deal. That's obvious. Everybody knows that. By the way, it's also very important in our public discourse to remember that Gilad Shalit is alive and well, and that whatever one wants to say about the deal, it wasn't his doing. And there's a lot of discussion of it, which it's Shalit. It wasn't Shalit. Shalit was captured. Shalit was freed. The people who made the decision to make the deal were not Shalit. He was just held by Hamas. I just think that there's a certain amount of derech eretz and a certain amount of honor that he's owed for what he went through, not to confuse him with the decision makers. He lived 5 years in hell. He got out. Thank God. He's married. He's living a fairly normal life. And though I obviously have no contact with him, I think that it has to be brutally painful to be Gilad Shalit these days, to see in the paper every day, Sinwar, comma, released as part of the Shalit deal, comma. It's a subordinate clause that is true, but very, very, very painful. And I think, at least for a moment, have in mind the terrible degree of discomfort that he must be experiencing on a day-to-day basis for something that was not his fault in any way whatsoever. But it was part of the Shalit. It was part of the Shalit deal. It was part of Entebbe. It was part of the rescue mission of Nachshon Wachsman, which failed in, I think, 1996, 1997. There was a sense of obligation to Jews all over the world, because Zionism and responsibility for Jews have basically been synonymous. Zionism argued that Jews need to have the capacity to be responsible for other Jews and need to exercise that capacity. And so whenever an Israeli soldier has been taken hostage, we have tried to get that soldier back. We failed, for example, with Ron Arad, but we tried very, very, very hard for a very, very, very long time. And with Baumel and all of the others. They were on the minds and hearts of Israelis literally for decades. And I was just saying to some of the students upstairs when we gathered a short while ago, that those of us who live in Israel, when the Mishaberach would come every Shabbat morning, and we would say at davening, the Mishaberach for all of the Ne'edarim, we all knew their names. Ron ben Batya, I think it was, right? I'm pretty sure that Ron, I mean, it's been many, many years already, but I seem to remember that we knew Ron Arad's Hebrew name and his mother's Hebrew name, and we knew Zechariah Baumel's name, and we knew his mother's Hebrew name. And as the IDF declared each of these people no longer alive, and they were taken out, it was almost like somebody had taken out a piece. Imagine somebody takes out one of the brachot of the Amida, and you're hearing the repetition of the Amida, and all of a sudden something glaring is missing, and you know it's wrong somehow. That's how it actually felt. I say all of that as background to what we're going through now as a way of expressing the degree, thank you very, very much. I actually came armed, but thank you very, very much. I say that as background to understanding the tremendous sense of failure that now pervades Israel. You can't, my kids all grew up in Israel, obviously, and my son who lives in LA, reads Hebrew. I mean, he's Israeli, and he lives in LA now. And as the war opened, he was reading all of the various apps. He knew exactly what was going on to the same extent that I knew what was going on. But at a certain point, he called up and he said, "Abba Nima, I'm coming," which meant Abba Nima, buy me a ticket. But that's fine. That's all good. And he came over for about a week, and he'd been in Israel for about a day and a half. We were watching the news together. And he said, "Abba, if you're not here, you just can't get it. All the facts are easily accessible, but you can't get how broken the country is until you walk around the streets. You can't get how shattered the country is until you talk to your friends. You can't understand the depth of the brokenheartedness until you breathe the air, until you see people walking down the street and you realize that the instinct is to say, 'Hi, how are you?' And you realize that that is the dumbest question in the world. So you've learned now to go like that when you see people on the street. Like, I'm not going to ask you how you are because I don't want to put you in the position of having to say something stupid. So you don't even ask. It's sort of like Tisha B'Av, when the halacha is that you can't ask people how they are. It's a 10-week-long Tisha B'Av in that regard. Nobody asks anybody how they are because how are you supposed to be? And why do you want, kamo kulam is the answer that everybody says. But all right, since you know that, why ask the question? But he said, until you come, you can't really get the brokenheartedness of it all. And therefore, the question that resides at the heart of the hostage issue is, of course, a question of how many to give up, and we're going to come back to that in a second, and so on and so forth. But you need to understand that it rests on a profound sense of unbelievable failure, of just unbelievable failure, which was compounded by the government's ongoing inability to assist the people who left their homes with only the clothes on their back. Now, I just want to remind everybody knows that there's hundreds of thousands of Israelis who are displaced. I mentioned to the students upstairs, I had a conversation with Michael Oren earlier this afternoon. He says to me he thinks the government's lying about the numbers. He thinks it's about 250,000 people who are probably displaced. But if you talk to the people who work in the various chamalim, the chadrei milchama, these citizen-run operations, so you're a person, you live in Be'eri, you're one of the lucky ones who doesn't get killed, and the army comes in after you've been hiding in whatever you've been hiding in for 10 hours or 15 hours or 18 hours, whatever it is, and they put you in a jeep or a car or a truck, and they take you somewhere, and they put you up overnight, and then within a day or two, the government says, okay, all the people from Be'eri are going to Yam HaMelech, they're going to the Dead Sea. Very nice. Now, you only have what you were wearing. And let's say you're 80 years old and you take a regimen of medications, which is not unusual. Okay, so you can find a doctor. You can go online and you can get your prescription. But where's the drugstore at Yam HaMelech? There is none. Or let's say you're younger and you have kids and they go to school. Where's the school in Yam HaMelech? There's no schools in Yam HaMelech. It's where Yerucham, Beersheba, Dimona, Yerushalayim, I mean, nothing close. And let's say somebody does take you to the pharmacy. The pharmacist is going to say, great, can I have your Maccabi card, please? Your Maccabi card doesn't exist. It burned down with your house. In other words, there was so much that nobody was prepared for that citizens had to step in the fray here and do all sorts of extraordinary things. As an aside, and I really don't want to get political tonight, but as an aside, this group, Chavirim, Achim Laneshek, brothers in arms, and then Achim Vachayot Laneshek, brother and sisters in arms, as they changed it over the course of time, had built this national apparatus for, if you were on their WhatsApp list, you would see, such and such a minister is leaving this building and going to that building. We need 50 protesters there at exactly 3:25. And that's how it worked. That's how it was working. It was pretty darn efficient. You may have applauded it. You may not have applauded it. I will say, by the way, for all those people who had their doubts about all those pilots who were refusing to train, it's important to note that those pilots were all in the air at 9 a.m. Every single solitary one of them was in the air at 9 a.m. And the commanders on the ground, the ones who were wearing the shirts but were not pilots, were in tanks at 8:30 a.m. And some of the people in Achim Laneshek were dead at 10 a.m. So it's important to remember that people who got tarred with a brush of not being patriotic, I think there's a lot of rethinking that many of us need to do. Patriotism manifests itself in a lot of different kinds of ways, and what the left in one country is not necessarily what the left is in a different country. And if the left in one country is actually distinctly not in love with the country, that does not mean that the left in every country is not in love with the country. And I mentioned also to the students upstairs, there was an international reporter that I was with like last week or the week before. She said to me, I'm trying to find all the progressive leaders and I can't find them. Where are they? I said, they're in tanks and cockpits. That's where they are. They're in the army. They're fighting the same war that the right-wing people that you don't want to talk to are fighting. Because, by the way, the kibbutzim along the Yotef were fundamentally left-wing kibbutzim. The number of peace activists who were slaughtered defies imagination, it defies description. So this breaks all of the assumptions that we had about many things, but there's a sense of failure about the people who were killed. There's a sense of failure about the people who were captured. We won't go into what was done to the women. We're not going to discuss it at all because it's simply too horrific to begin to discuss, except to say that yesterday's Haaretz is talking about, we're only 10 weeks in, a very high suicide rate among the women survivors. We're only 10 weeks in. And they didn't give the numbers, but psychologists are saying that there's already a phenomenon of the women who survived what they survived not wanting to live. I mean, things that happened are beyond description. And I said this before, but I just at the risk of repeating myself. Our son was called up on Shabbat afternoon. And he was in a commando unit for 8 years. And we actually spoke to him, Motzei Yontif, and he said, they called me up, so I'm going, but I haven't fired a gun in 7.5 years. What are they going to send us to do commando raids again? Really? I haven't trained in 8 years. Now, they didn't send them in right away, but he was also a medic. And they took all the medics, because nobody knew what was happening. You have to remember that even Motzei Shabbat and Sunday and Monday, the numbers kept rising. It's sort of like a tsunami or an earthquake, and nobody really knew what the numbers were. It took several days until we understood the order of magnitude of this horror, but certainly Motzei Shabbat, Motzei Shmini Atzeret, Motzei Simchat Torah, which for us was all exactly the same thing, nobody had any idea what was going on. And they took all the medics, and he had been trained as a medic also, and they sent them to the south, to what's called the Shetach Isuf, an area where they gather everybody, and that's where all the tanks line up before they cross the border. It's where all the APCs line up. It's where they set everything up. And they sent all these medics because there were rumors that there were a lot of wounded people. That's all they knew. So they called in the medics. By the time they got there, people understood that these people didn't need medics. They needed surgical theaters. Like a guy like my son who had, a few months of medic training, it's completely useless. So they had these hundreds of medics there with nothing to do, and they're sitting around. And that Saturday night, the soldiers who had gone to the kibbutzim far too late, not their fault, but far too late, and that had fought their way through and had liberated most of the kibbutzim by Saturday night, not all of them, some of them it took till Sunday and Monday, came out, and they were also taken to the Shetach Isuf. Now, the army had obviously not set up psychological services for the soldiers on Saturday night. And the soldiers had seen things that Jews had not seen in 80 years. And most of the Jews who saw it 80 years ago didn't live to tell the story. The soldiers had seen things that they'd only seen in Shoah movies. And they needed to talk. So they came and they talked. And they stayed up all night talking. What does it mean to see what was people in a car that is now this charred thing that roughly represents the shape of a human being, but not really? What does it mean to find a formerly pregnant woman with her fetus outside her body, both of them dead? What does it mean to see families holding each other, hugging each other, all riddled with bullets on their beds in pools of blood in the sovereign state of Israel? And when we saw our son finally, I think it was Monday night, he got out for a night or two, and we went up to see them in Givatayim where they live. He's in his mid-30s. He was a changed human being. He was a changed human being. Because when he was a commando, he was just a kid. A big kid, but a kid. And now he's a father. And when you hear stories about 3-year-old children shot point blank in the head, and you have a kid who's almost 3 years old, it speaks to you differently, and you understand the barbarity in a way that you couldn't understand it before. And his sense was a sense of utter failure. He was minding his own business. He wasn't even in the army. But he said to us that week, and I'll never forget it, he said, "Abba, if we don't get every single hostage back, this country is a failure." Now, I don't know that he would say that today, because we're not getting every single hostage back. But that sense of failure is what permeates everything. The failure to protect, the failure to rescue, the failure to provide. Zionism failed on October 7th. It's irrelevant for the moment, who is behind that and who's responsible. That's a whole other set of questions which we'll get to down the road, not tonight probably, but it's a sense of permanent and profound failure, which leads us to the hostages. The hostages are hostages because we failed them. It's not Entebbe. It's not Gilad Shalit. He's captured in a battle. You can say he made a mistake, he didn't make a mistake, completely irrelevant. It was a battle. Hamas came, he was a soldier. It's a whole different ballgame. And Israel feels torn between two profound sets of responsibilities. Responsibilities to the hostages and their families. And as I mentioned upstairs, Hirsch Goldberg, Poland's parents, davened in Armenian. So when you're davening near his father, you look in the eyes, it changes your davening. And you don't know exactly how a person in that situation gets up in the morning or goes to sleep at night. You just don't even know how they function. I mean, think of all, let's be very honest, right? All of us get told you need to go have test X done. Medical test X or Y, or most of us have had that. And you go, you get it done. You think the chances are you're probably okay, but you want to know for sure. And those days that pass before you get your fairly routine test and the results feel like an eternity. It's been 74 days. So when you daven with somebody like that, you say to yourself, well, obviously, you have to get them out, no matter what it takes. And then you talk to people whose kids died, literally trying to rescue hostages, and the people that they got to were already dead. And you go to that shiva, and you say to yourself, that wasn't worth it. And which one is right? The reality is that they are both right. They are all the result of a failure of exercising responsibility, and we now have different sets of responsibilities that we want to act on that we cannot act on all at the same time. You can't try to rescue hostages and not risk the possibility that Gadi Eisenkot's son and nephew are going to come back dead. And you can't decide, I'm not risking those kids or any other kids, and look the hostage families in the face and say, sorry, it's not worth more kids' lives. The heartbreak of the hostages is the heartbreak of the failure of Zionism. The heartbreak of the hostages is the heartbreak of the country not having done what is the fundamental obligation of every single country. And there's no good answer to this. I'm going to say two things as a way of wrapping up, and then we'll open it up. I don't know what we should do about the hostages. I don't know what we can do. I'm not a military person. I'm obviously not privy to any of those discussions, which is exactly how it should be. So I don't know what we can do. I don't know what we should do. I don't know what risks are worth taking. I just don't know. But here's two things that I do know. One of them is we simply, absolutely have to win this war. We have to win this war because if we don't, the reason that every country in our region has made a deal with us, which is our strength, evaporates. The sheikhs who run the UAE did not become Zionists. Their wives are not members of Hadassah. They're not. They did not become enamored by, Alt-Neuland. They didn't read Jabotinsky's Iron Wall and go, oh, I want to be part of that. They said, this is a strong country, and Iran is here, and we want to be partners with a strong country. A country that's not strong enough to win this war against a group of terrorists is not a country that's terribly appealing to the UAE. And it's not terribly appealing to Bahrain. And it's not going to be terribly appealing to Saudi Arabia. And God only knows what Egypt will think. And, by the way, the other enemies on our borders will smell blood. We have to win this thing, and I don't know exactly what that means, but it certainly means Hamas not being in control and the Hamas not being able to fire rockets, which they are still doing 74 days in. And I'll remind you that in the first 8 days of the war, we dropped more bombs on Gaza than the United States dropped on Afghanistan in a year. 8 days, we dropped more bombs on Gaza than the United States dropped on Afghanistan in an entire year. I mean, the amount of armaments that have been dropped there is unbelievable. And by the way, I think every caring human being ought to look at the wreck that is Gaza and understand that there are some innocent people there. I don't know if it's 2% or 80%. I have absolutely no idea, and none of you have any idea. But there's some of them. And the 2-year-olds in Gazan emergency rooms who are being treated without anesthesia, they didn't do anything. I'm not saying we shouldn't do what we're doing, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that we have to be able to hold both in our brokenheartedness. There are children there who are freezing at night and suffering during the day. They didn't do anything. But we have to do what we need to do in order to win, because otherwise we will not be around. Not because enemy armies are going to come in and take over Yerushalayim, Tel Aviv, and Hadera, and Yerucham tomorrow, but because the grandchildren of the people sitting in this room, when they are the age of the people in this room, will look back at 2023 as the tipping point when the decline began. What's at stake is not the Otef, and what's at stake is not the North, and what's at stake is not Hamas. What's at stake is everything. And the impossibility of the situation with the hostages is simply a microcosm of the impossibility of all the decisions that we have to make with people who are human beings on the other side, although I'm not a huge believer that the vast majority of them are peace-seeking adults. That's not my view, but I don't really know. All very complex. So the first of the 2 points with which I wanted to conclude was we absolutely positively have to win this war. We probably also have to win the war in the north, even if we have to start it, because it can't go on this way. It's not normal for children to have bomb shelters under their swing sets. It's just not normal. And nobody in their right mind is going to move back to Kiryat Shmona knowing that Hezbollah is training people to cross the border just the way that Hamas did. And everybody should understand that the weakest of all of our enemies is Hamas. They are the weakest. Hezbollah is stronger, Iran is stronger. We're fighting the Cub Scouts at this point, relatively speaking. So we have to win. The second point that I want to make, and with this I'll close, is this. I said several times that I think the state of Israel failed its citizens on October 7th. About that, I think there's nothing to discuss. And I put it in terms that Zionism failed to live up to its promise, and that to a certain extent I think is unfortunately true. But here is the way in which Zionism did not fail. And I'll go back to where I started, and with this I'll conclude. The promise that Zionism made was not that we're going to have a country that's going to be impregnable. It did make that promise, but that was not the central promise. The promise that Zionism made was we're going to create a new Jew. And that we did do. Because after Kishinev, the Jews just bandaged themselves up as best they could. After Khordakov, and there's a picture of it in the book, for which I'm very, very grateful once again and very deeply honored by the decision of the judges. There's a photograph in that book of the Jews of Khordakov after the pogrom, just standing there like stick figures wrapped in gauze, wondering when it would happen again. That is not true of the young women and the young men in the tanks and the cockpits. And it wasn't true of the thousands of people who transformed Achim and Achayot LaNeshek into the world's largest citizen-run aid bank by Shabbat afternoon. By Shabbat afternoon in Yerushalayim, there were 2,000 volunteers running the Hamal. I mean, it was by 4 o'clock. The thing happened at 6:30. That's also the new Jew. The Jew who says that the sense of responsibility that lies at the heart of Zionism still beats in that heart. The sense of responsibility to the hostages, and the sense of responsibility to the anguished families, the sense of responsibility to the far too many 23-year-old widows. A lot of 23-year-old widows. And a lot of orphans. We lost a student, we're a tiny school. We've lost a student, we've lost a nephew of a faculty person, we've lost a grandson of a faculty person, and there's 2 others, combos that I'm not remembering now. But the student who died left a wife and a 3-year-old daughter and a 1-year-old daughter. There are kids who are going to have no memories of their fathers or their mothers. We owe it to them. We owe it to their parents. We owe it, if we get these hostages out, to be with them not for the next months or years or decades, but to be at their sides for the rest of whatever is left for their pain-filled lives. And in addition to all of that, we need to take a moment to have a sense of pride. That this society reacted in ways in which I can't imagine any other society reacting and responding. That the sense of achdut and the sense of responsibility and the sense of that we can accomplish virtually anything, even if the government isn't prepared or is not willing or whatever the situation is politically, that we can actually run this country from the bottom up. And that's been an extraordinary story also. So what happened in Zionism on October 7th is actually a much more complicated story than I started out by saying. The state of Israel failed the citizens of the Oteif. About that, there's nothing to discuss. And the army failed the citizens of the Oteif at the beginning of that day. There's nothing to discuss. By the end of the day, the army had recouped, and by now the army is showing itself to be, they're calling this Dor HaNitzachon, the victorious generation. These young people are made of stuff that is simply unbelievable. Unbelievable. And this is a story of those people rising to the occasion, and it's the story of citizens, men and women, young and old, religious and secular, Jew and Arab. There's a Hamal in Rahat, and Haredi women started a Hamal. And 2,000 Haredi men volunteered for the IDF and did a very quick basic training and graduated, and the ceremony of them graduating with Hatikva being sung made its way all around Israeli social media. That's also part of what Zionism is. In other words, those people had breathed in the air and the oxygen out of the ether of Zionism without really knowing that they had. This was the worst year in Israel's history, without question, but it's also some of the most extraordinary moments in Israel's history, without question. And what we have to hope and pray is that the extraordinary moments in the course of the months and years ahead will outnumber the moments of grief. We have to hope and pray that we can figure out what is so extraordinary about this country that created a generation like this generation that we created without even knowing that we'd created it, even thinking that we hadn't created it. And understanding the power that the Zionist dream has even on these people that we said about them, all they want to do is code and go public. And they did want to code, and they did want to go public, but they were also willing to get into tanks and cockpits. Something extraordinary about the power of Zionism and its promise of the transformation of the Jewish people transcended and survived even one of the worst days in all of Jewish history. That is a source, I think, of pride. That is a source of hope. And I'll just end by saying that the idea of the title of the book was, long before anybody could have imagined this, the notion that impossible takes longer means we set for ourselves a very high bar. We had great dreams, and we still have great dreams. It's now going to take a lot longer than we thought. But the fundamental promise is that you stay at it as long as it takes. And for the recognition, I hope and pray that of the truth of that fundamental premise, I want to once again thank the Herenstein Sacks Center at Yeshiva University. I want to thank Dr. Erica Brown and Dr. Shira Weiss for their extraordinary collegiality and friendship over the course of these past weeks and months. And thank Yeshiva University for the great honor, and conclude by thanking all of you for being here tonight. Thank you. Where's Erica?
Thank you, Dr. Gordis. It was a painful, candid, very sobering analysis of where we are in this moment, of bearing witness, of in some way helping us understand what our mishpacha is experiencing there, because we're also experiencing the pain here. And I know that you've agreed to sign some books at the end. I've been thinking, I just want to ask a question and then open it up. First of all, I want to acknowledge Andrea and Terry Herenstein. Give a wave in the back. Thank you so much. This is all possible because of you, and we're grateful. I keep thinking about, I think about Rabbi Sacks so often, and I particularly think about him in moments when his voice would have been all over the newspapers, in the news cycle, responding in interfaith conferences, giving voice, a sort of prophetic voice, a prophetic voice to the moment. And I'm wondering, I can't make up what he would say, and you've given us a sense of hope in Israelis. When you look here at Diaspora Jewry, what gives you hope? And how can we help our mishpacha there?
It's an excellent question. I also want to I didn't see them in the back there, so I want to express my gratitude to Terry and Andrew Herenstein, who are, as many of you know of them, extraordinary leaders of the Jewish community, extraordinary balei tzedakah, and they happen to be wonderful friends, so it's wonderful to see you guys hiding in the back. And thank you for being here once again. I'm doing this thing with Rabbi David Ingber tomorrow at the 92nd Street Y to talk about how each of our worlds has collapsed. He is an American rabbi in the Upper West Side, and me as an Israeli living in Yerushalayim. A lot of our assumptions have collapsed, and ironically, I think brokenheartedness creates openness, and shared brokenheartedness, even if it's born of slightly different circumstances, creates a sense of camaraderie and a sense of mutual responsibility. I will say something first about Israelis and other viewing here. A lot of Israelis A lot of Israelis know the name Claudine Gay. A lot more Israelis know the name Claudine Gay today than Americans knew the name Claudine Gay 3 weeks ago. I'm not exaggerating. She's in all the Israeli papers. I'm not sure she's getting great nachas out of it. The good news for her is she can't read Hebrew, I assume. But Israelis are following what's happening in America very, very closely. Largely because what's happening in America is another sort of, I'm not going to say failure of, but dent in Zionism. Find that little book called The Jewish State by Herzl. You've heard of him. And there's a thing that he says towards the end, and it's usually available for free on Kindle. They take it in and take it out, but it's usually on that Kindle-free library, so run home. But in any event, he says that part of the reason there's anti-Semitism is because we're so abnormal. We don't have that language. We don't have that home. We're kind of parasites. We're seen as parasites wherever we go. And he says, therefore, the minute we have a state of our own, the hatred of the Jew in the diaspora is going to disappear. That was wrong. Right? Bialik knew it was wrong, and Jabotinsky knew it was wrong. Other Zionists who followed Herzl knew that it was wrong. But at the core of Zionism, there was always this hope that maybe, just maybe, what we're doing is also going to heal Jews everywhere. And there is a sense of heartbreak in Israel about what's happening here. You may or may not have followed the interview that was given to an Israeli journalist by the deputy mayor of Paris, I guess by now, the week before last. It's a woman, I forget her name, and I apologize for that. She was interviewed by some Israeli journalist in French, and then it was reproduced with his Hebrew subtitles. And he asked her, do you think the Jews have a future in France? To which her response was, I really don't know. And I think what astounded Israelis was that she didn't even realize she's supposed to lie. That's your job as the deputy mayor of Paris to say, of course. Jews are central to our society, and we're going to protect the synagogues and blah, 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 blah. She just was honest. And Israelis looked at that, and they, oh my God, and they watched these congressional hearings. They don't know all the characters are exactly, and I think they were kind of astonished by the decorum. Only one person spoke at a time. They were kind of like, how do they do that? My dad was an epidemiologist. When I was growing up, nobody knew what an epidemiologist was. They said, what does your dad do? I said, he's an epidemiologist. Oh, a skin doctor. Like, no, you moron. It's not for epidermis. But in any event, nowadays, of course, everybody knows what epidemiologists are. But the reason I mention that is he once went actually to a conference at Beersheba University. I think it was at the medical school at Soroka, and there were all these German visiting scientists, and they saw people smoking in the hospital at Soroka. And they said, oh my, in Germany, nobody smokes in a hospital. So my father very innocently said, well, how did you accomplish that? They said, we put up signs that said no smoking. That did not work in Israel. But in any event, so I think they were sort of taken by this congressional thing, like even though it's very hostile, everybody speaks in turn. But in any event, Israelis are horrified by that. And Israelis are deeply brokenhearted by what's happening here. They really, really are. Because at the end of the day, with all due respect to the extraordinary diasporas around the world, and there are amazing diasporas around the world, each of them with their own extraordinary qualities, but 90% of the Jewish world lives in Israel and America, 88%, 90%-ish. It's about half and half statistically, more or less. And if both of these Jewish communities are under existential threat of different sorts, it is a crisis for the Jewish people of the sort that we haven't witnessed perhaps since Tkufat Bayit Sheni. I mean, that's actually really possible. Because during the Holocaust, whatever one wants to say about the American response, non-response, it's a different subject. This particular Jewish community, which was already millions and millions of people, was not under any direct threat. And if anything, it was only going to grow stronger by virtue of the people who, thank God, did survive and managed to come here. So this is the first time that 90% of the Jewish world has been under very real threat of different sorts. So on the Israeli side, I think there is a tremendous sense of heartbreak for what's happening here and a sense of responsibility. Israelis know that they can't fix Harvard, and they can't fix Penn, and they can't fix MIT, and much more importantly, they can't fix all of the culture that creates the elementary schools, who trains the kids who become the junior high school students, who become the high school students, who become the Harvard students. It doesn't start on college campuses. It's deeply embedded in the DNA of America now. We know we can't fix that, but we can feel a sense of shared anguish. And I want to say on the other side that Israelis feel embraced by American Jews in a way that I don't ever remember Israelis feeling, even during the Intifada. By the way, during Intifada, if you recall, American Jews basically didn't come. And the King David, I remember, had one floor that was open, so you would walk by on a Friday night to go somewhere, and you'd see the entire hotel dark except for one row of lights, and the Inbal had one row or two rows open. People stopped coming, and tourism is down 90% from November, December of last year. It's understandable, but American Jews are coming not as tourists. They're actually in the fields. You know that you raised $1 billion, and we're going to need a lot more because the Otefa is going to have to be rebuilt, and with 20%, they say, of the workforce now in the reserves for however, God knows how long it's going to be. But Israelis feel embraced. Israelis feel brokenhearted for what's happening here, and Israelis feel embraced by the response of American Jews. And I think what you're saying, I'm an outsider now. I've been gone for a very long time. But as an outsider looking in, it feels to me like the center of the tent is congealing and coming together in a way that previous divides would not have allowed us to think would make possible. There is a fringe, and we won't go into which groups are part of that fringe, and they're not in the tent. But the vast majority of the broken tent is now much more part of a whole tent, I think. And so again, that's also a sense of, again, one hesitates to say silver lining out of such a horrible catastrophe. But there are moments of hope and moments of brightness, and I think that's what Rabbi Sacks was so adept at pointing to. He understood the miraculous in almost every Jewish situation. He understood the embrace of life, the embrace of goodness, the embrace of a sense of continuity and anchoredness in the tempestuous seas of time. That was his unique genius. There was never a voice like that before, and there's never a voice like that since. And we'll see what happens down the road in the future. Perhaps one of the Sacks-Herenstein fellows will be the people, I mean that in all seriousness, who will come in and inherit that extraordinary role of Rabbi Sacks. But this is also a tremendous moment of healing for Am Yisrael. And I think he would have pointed to the need for that. He would have pointed to the possibility of that. And I think he would have celebrated the fact that we're already seeing it happening.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for setting such high aspirations for us. We have time for a few questions, and we'll keep them short and as questions. Yes, sir.
You refer to it as a failure of Zionism. Isn't it truer to say it's a theological failure? It's a failure of God to fulfill his promises to the Jewish people? And my question is, God forbid we don't win the war, we don't free the hostages. Can God survive another Holocaust? What is the future of Jewish faith?
Oh, just the question of theodicy, that's all. Nothing. We always start. Yeah, from what I, is it a failure of Zionism or is it a failure of God to protect those people? And can God survive another Holocaust? I think that's more or less the way you put it, right? Well, I definitely know the answer to that question. I want you to understand, right? No, look, I mean, you're obviously asking one of the world's oldest theological questions. I mean, that's right. I mean, Rasha V'Tovlo and so on and so forth. I katonti to try to answer a theological question at Yeshiva University with the minds who might very well be in this room. What I'll say is, so I don't know. I don't know about that. I don't know where God was in the Holocaust. I mean, we had friends just called me an hour before I came up here whose daughter gave birth this morning to a full-term stillborn child. I mean, it's one little baby, and God willing, they'll be okay, and they'll have more children. But still, for that couple tonight, it's absolute heartbreak. And one could ask about that too, because 3 days ago, everything was totally fine. So look, the problem of evil in God, far exceeds my minuscule capacities. But here's what I will say about God. It's an unbelievable thing to see soldiers lighting Chanukiot in the rain in Gaza, to find some little something or other that's covered, and to find a place where it's okay to get out of the tank and to light Chanukiot. And the ones who are wearing kippot to keep wearing the kippot, and the ones who are not wearing kippot to find a helmet, and to say in the middle of Chanukah, Ki archa lanu hayeshua ve'en ketz limei hara'a. Because it's taken the last stanza of Mao's Tzur until last week when Noam Vered added another stanza, which I'll come back to in a minute. The Vered Noam added another stanza. I really do want to talk about that. But there's something about that that's godly. There's something about that that's godly. People are finding a sense of the transcendent and the permanent in the Jewish story and having to be in that battle on Hanukkah. That's not an answer to what God was doing. I understand that I'm totally dodging the question, but because I can't answer it. But I do want to say that I looked at some of these stories, and it's an unbelievable thing to see people singing Hallel in a tank in Gaza. That's an unbelievable thing. It's a quest for God. It says nothing about what God is doing or was doing, but it is a quest for a sense that Shiviti Hashem lenagdi tamid, right? No matter where I am, I want God to be part of this. And, I'm going to come back to Vered Noam for a quick second. Mao's Tzur is one of those songs that some people don't sing at all. The vast majority of people who sing it sing one stanza. That's about 70%, I think. Another 25% sing Mao's Tzur and Yevanim Nikbetzu Alai, because it's the one stanza that's actually about the story of the Hashmonaim. And the other ones are in there for Rabbi Sacks to translate, right? But nobody really sings them. The truth of the matter is that Mao's Tzur is an unbelievable story. And I'll actually tell you a story about this. I'll tell you a true Mao's Tzur story. Because it's got a stanza about the Egyptians, and it's got a stanza about the Greeks, and it's got a stanza about the Romans, and it's got a stanza about the Maccabees, and so forth. And Vered Noam, who's the first woman in Israel to win the Israel Prize for Talmud, she wrote about Megillat Ta'anit as her really major work. She's an extraordinary scholar. She wrote a new stanza for Mao's Tzur about this war. And the nature of technology is that all that had to happen was for Sefaria to put it online. And I know dozens of Israeli families who downloaded it, printed it, and sang it by their Chanukiot. We certainly did. And it's brilliant. It's got plays on language that one really needs. Like Anshe Hamas Naflu Alai. Hamas spelled Chet Mem Samach. That's not how you spell the group. You spell the group Chet Mem Aleph Samach. Hamas in Hebrew means evil, right? And then she has a line in there, I think, Meche Chotef Uvne Otef. Right, so wipe out the kidnapper and rebuild the Otef. But I mean, the language is so evocative, it's brilliant. And that's what a living civilization is all about. That a song that's centuries old takes on new meaning and then takes on new life just because of the realities of this. So a quick story of how these things work in life. And I think it speaks about Zionism and it speaks about purpose and so on. So our daughter, who now lives in Boston while her husband is finished up a doctorate in an unmentionable university in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Before she was engaged, I think they were already together, it doesn't matter. She had just gotten out of the Army. She was a first-year law student. I think it was the 2012 or 2014 war. I think it was 2012, but it doesn't matter. She gets a call from her former commander. She'd been out of the Army only for a few months. Her field back then actually was Hamas. We didn't know that until many years later. And her commander told her, this is an unofficial off-the-record call, but you should be ready to come back in. So she comes home and she says, what am I going to do? I'm a first semester law student. I can't leave. I'm going to fail out. Of course, I'm going to fail out. My life will end. I'll have no meaning. The cosmos, God, theodicy, the whole shebang. Young women at that age, especially my daughter, go, okay, whatever. I said to her, calm down, let's see if you get the call, whatever. You may have heard that Hanukkah is 8 days long, so a few days later, it's still Hanukkah, she gets the call, so she has to come home and to get her stuff out of the attic, the boots, the uniform, the this, the that. And she comes home and she's very upset, her eyes are all red. She's scared. She's scared of missing school, she actually had to go near Gaza and whatever. And we were at that point, my wife and I were the only two home. Everybody had already moved out at that point. And we're putting the candles in the Chanukiot, and Tali walks in the living room door, and she's all worked up. And then she sort of stomps up the stairs to go to the attic to go get her stuff. And I said to my wife, in a few minutes, we are going to have a massive meltdown. And she said, "We'll handle it," by which she meant, "You'll handle it." And Tali comes downstairs. Herensteins have a Tali too, but a different Tali. And she was really very upset. She had to go, like mamash, to the Shitche Isuf outside Gaza. It's not so safe. It's cold. It's freezing. And she's really worried about school, of course, because she's a Jewish girl. And she's crying. And she's a tiny little thing, even to the, she's a mom of 3, but she's a tiny little thing. And I had my arm around her, and we're singing, did the brachot, and Hanerot Halalu, and Ma'oz Tzur. And in our, OCD family, all of the stanzas of Ma'oz Tzur. And she's singing along, but with that little whimpering quiver in her voice. And then we got to the last stanza. And she speaks Hebrew very well. And it says, Ki archa lanu hayeshuah, ve'en ketzli mehara'ah. And literally, as we were singing that salvation is taking too long to come and there's no end to the evil, I literally felt her body change. Like she stood up and she stopped crying and she sang. And, we said hello, we said goodbye, we didn't play dreidel. And she put on her big green parka thing and she went out the door to catch a ride to go to war. And thank God, is alive and well, and grandchildren, all of that. But it's a point, the point is that that's also God. That lighting candles and singing Ma'oz Tzur and being reminded that you are part of a perennial story. I think Rabbi Sacks would have pointed to that. I think he would have said that there's God in that moment when you see yourself not as a first-year law student who's going to flunk out, which obviously she did not, but you see yourself as law school doesn't really matter because the Jewish people is calling on you to do something. So I don't know where God was, but I know that we have to seek God and we have to find God, and our job as Jews is to find God's presence, to be enriched and enlarged by God's presence, and to whatever extent we're blessed to feel it, to try to share that gift with as many others as we can inside our people and beyond.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you for this analysis, perceptive, painful, hopeful, courageous. We pray for your son and for your daughter. They're all our sons. They're all our daughters. They're all our brothers. They're all our sisters. They're our mishpacha. And thank you for bringing us into your mishpacha. I think the only appropriate way to end is to sing Hatikva. Would you lead us in Hatikva?
I know the words.
Okay. If we can all rise, please.
Can I make a suggestion that we start with Achenu?
Please.
I just think I'm a fan of Hatikva. Let the record not be misrepresented. But we sit in this glorious center of Jewish learning, in the comfort of a lovely auditorium, and some of us even got fed before it, and it's extraordinary. And then I think we have an obligation to just remember literally the living hell that we can't even begin to imagine, that 100-something people are in at this moment. And even more than Hatikva, it seems to me that we ought to sing Achenu. So we'll do Achenu, then we'll do Hatikva, and then we'll call it a night.
Thank you, everyone, and good night. Am Yisrael Chai.